4 sessions. And then now I'm just, So thank you all for joining. I'm going to hush up and let Leonora start the meeting and kick us off, and then I'll jump in after that.
All right. So it's 6 o'clock. I'd like to call the City of Kenmore Diversity, Equity, Inclusion meeting to order for Thursday, June 9th, 2022. I will now take the roll, and I'd like to please ask that task force members, please have your cameras on and say you are verbally present as I call your name. Thank you. Darlene Ademba.
Present.
Juanita Aguilar.
Present.
David Arthur.
Present.
Marco Ballesteros. Marco. Lily Bishop.
Present.
Bill Castro. Peggy Evans. Jeannie Galloway. Carlos Gill.
Right here.
Juliana Pooley.
Present.
Nancy Tai. Nancy?
Present.
Oh, thank you. Aisha Jallo.
Present.
All right. So it's now time for public comment, and we'd love to hear from you. So please raise your hand now if you'd like to speak, and you will have about 2 minutes to give comments. Anastasia, do we have anyone from the community who's raising their hand or interested in public comment?
Thank you so much, Leonora. We do see Stacy V that has raised her hand. Stacy, give us a second. We'll display the timer and you can go ahead. And while we wait for that, I just wanted to let people know the reason why we're off screen is actually the clerks are in the council chambers. And as you know, the governor has asked that we revert back to original OPMA rules, which allow the public to have a physical location to join in on all our meetings. But the hybrid model allows us to take comments virtually or on site. So if you hear the voice from beyond, it's us coming from the council chambers. Ms. Valenzuela, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Stacy Valenzuela, Kenmore. This year brought about a couple things, but being another year celebrating Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, I again requested a proper apology from the city to the Chapalanga family and friends that came forward at a public comment meeting to save their property at 175th Street. The city tried pressuring them for a year. When they kept saying no, that the property had sentimental value and meant so much to them, they decided to use eminent domain to try to take their property, which English being their second language and cultural differences, they had no idea they could fight this. A developer was trying for 2 years to build on his property, and every time he checked his permit, he was told he was charged additional fees. Finally, when he came forward to the city council meeting and coffee with council, he was able to get his stuff done. Will the DEI task force help to residents and developers with this problem? I think it's very important because a lot of the people that are struggling do not understand the system, need help understanding the system, and need to save their properties. This is so important, and it's such a crisis, and it's so wrong to do to certain people. It just breaks my heart, and I'm hoping that you guys can do something about it. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Ms. Valenzuela. Is there anyone else wishing to speak? We do see one other member. Stand by. Ms. File, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, Diversity and Equity Inclusion Task Force. I want to thank you for all your hard work, your dedication and commitment to this work and to our city and our community at large. It's very important work, and I was very excited to see the response of the recent survey from our community and that effort that was put into ensuring a better outreach to the community to ensure participation. Beyond that, I do and am aware of that the task force would like to possibly do a little bit more and get involved and possibly host events or lead with an event with the community. It is a possibility of the task force. There is a way to have that done. Basically, if you can have a consensus of what you want to do, make a motion and have a second or have a group consensus, and then have a vote. That's an outcome of one direction of ensuring you can have a event. And then the ask would go on to the city manager or the council. The other pathway is through a community love note project. Anybody can do this, and it could be just a couple people on your task force who are committed to arts and engagement and fostering community engagement and outreach for events such as Juneteenth or other important event dates. So I encourage you to explore your options. There is support within the city on this other side, and I am here today in my community hat and no other official capacity. But again, thank you for your hard work and efforts.
Thank you, Ms. File. Is there anyone else wishing to speak? Is there anyone else wishing to speak? And I will confirm that we have no one in the council chambers. There's no one else wishing to speak at this time.
Okay, thank you. So we will move to the approval of the minutes. At this point, these are the minutes that you received prior to the meeting, and I'll suggest that we approve the minutes through unanimous consent. All in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, hearing none, the minutes stand approved. So as we move into agenda items, I just want to share a big thank you to the task force members who have performed outreach to our communities in Kenmore during movie night and sending the survey out to community members. Just want to let you know your contributions have assisted us with the survey results that Shannon will be sharing with you in the update and debrief findings. So I will now turn it over to Shannon.
Thank you so much. So let me just pull up my screen here to share, make it easier for us. Okay, oh wait, here we go. So today we have the results, finding, and assessment for the City of Kenmore Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Community Culture Survey. The survey ran through the month of May and closed on Friday, June 3rd after midnight. We had some pretty good success, got some really good insights. You should have had copies or seen the information published on the city's website. So one of the things that you got also that generally a contractor doesn't provide is you've got a dashboard. And with that dashboard, you can download Power BI as a software program. Power BI is a Microsoft product or tool. With Power BI, and you can do that for free, by the way, you don't have to pay for that. So you can download your own copy of Power BI to be able to open the survey. But what it allows for you to do is take a look at all of the responses that we have from the survey, and you can essentially do a disaggregate of that data. You can search by factor, by demographic factor. So in that survey, you are able to search by racial background, by gender, by many other factors. So you can look at what responses to the survey are in those different areas. So take advantage of that survey, play around in there if you like. You also have access to 100% of the raw data from the survey. You are able to look at not just the synopsis and assessment that we've done to look at trends, patterns, and significant key insights from the survey, but you're able to look at all of the findings and data, but more importantly, you're also able to look at the responses, each of the responses to the open-ended questions. So when people typed in their comments with regard to DEIB in the city of Kenmore, you see everything that people shared with us, good, bad, or and indifferent. So you've got all of that. I'm going to jump in and share with you what we found. So in terms of approach, I'll cover approach, key insights, main findings, and share with you the dashboard data without factoring in demographic difference, but I'll also cover some of that. I'll cover my recommendations to you as a subject matter expert in diversity and equity management for the city of Kenmore. And then the appendix is simply all of the slides that represent all of the raw data from the survey. So you have every page of data included even in this document. We made it available to you. We wanted to make it available to the community so that the community would be able to see what representatives of Kenmore's community thought. And Kenmore's community represents people who live in Kenmore, who work in Kenmore, or who recreate in the city of Kenmore. And so that is what is meant by community. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as a theory of change within an organization or community supports the ability to fully leverage the many different lived experiences, perspectives, and unique insights within the population to achieve desired results. What does that mean for the city of Kenmore? Creating and nurturing the experience of belonging is not automatic within a community. And again, belonging is the difference between my creating an event or a party, if you will, and inviting, for example, HR director and DEI manager, Leonora Polania. I can invite Leonora to my dance party, and she would be a conditional guest, but I would choose the music, the venue, the food, and everything that would determine the culture of that event. That is inclusion. But to build a culture of belonging would mean that Leonora and I together design the event, that we get together design the experience, not for my liking to include her, but she and I together would build that beloved space that we would equally enjoy, that we would equally occupy, and we would equally inform. And for the city of Kenmore, belonging is to create the beloved community that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned that he spoke about, that was a community built for the betterment and quality of life for all, built to represent the voices, the histories, the richness of perspective of everyone in the community, not the many to the detriment of the few, but it's a space that exists that everyone truly feels like was curated with their interests, their needs, and their well-being in mind. And so that's what we talked about and looked like when we looked for when we talked about the elements that drive building this community for Kenmore. It requires shared values, communication, and common bonds. Each of these elements are driven by different cultural elements among the many different stakeholders or community members. The 8 different drivers of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which are critical elements that promote, support, maintain, and sustain DEIB best practices. They are diverse representation in a community, or participation can be enjoyed by those of all backgrounds and experiences. Psychological safety and voice, bringing our full selves and sharing our insights without fear of penalty or punishment. Transparency and accountability, having ownership for results of actions to achieve goals. Equitable rules and systems, those policies, processes, and procedures that produce equal access, justice, and equity for every member of the community. Shared benefit and mutual interest, meaning individual and or collective goals where desired outcomes are achieved together. Belonging and connection, trust, value, and respect as part of the whole community. Value and accept differences, the incorporation of diverse lived experiences, insights, and perceptions into decision-making. And finally, commitment to change, the will, desire, and promise to actively work toward a desired state where everyone can thrive as both individuals and as a group. And so those are the pillars, that's the foundation of building DEIB in a community. Our survey design, the survey mode, it was a self-administered survey online. It was open and available to the community between May 2nd, 2022 and closed June 3rd at the end of day 2022. The demographic breaks or the different demographic breakdowns in terms of information or data that we allow for people to voluntarily self-identify. How many years did they live in Kenmore? What type of dwelling do they occupy? What is their gender identity, their age, race and ethnicity, their place of birth, US or foreign born, household income, languages spoken in home, whether or not they were a person with a disability, and then their relationship to the city of Kenmore. We had 544 respondents to the survey with an 87% completion rate. What that means in terms of completion rate, people would open the survey, they could choose to answer all of the questions or some. 87% of respondents chose to answer all of the survey responses. The dashboard survey analyzes survey responses for the City of Kenmore's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Community Survey. We've given you definitions in terms of what is meant by ethnicity, language, years in the community, different racial and ethnic backgrounds, and income. So as part of the dashboard, there is a page that allows for definitions. The analytical explanation, we used a 5-point agreement scale for the survey statements. And we say most statements because again, several at the end of the survey were open-ended and were not weighted in terms of sentiment or response. The top 2 score boxes, very valuable and valuable. The 2 top boxes are the percentage of respondents who selected either a 4 or 5 as their response to a survey statement. The middle indicates neutrality, which can mean neither the respondent nor means either the respondent doesn't have a strong feeling one way or the other, or that they chose to not to identify. So it was neutral, it was not counted in a positive or negative sentiment. And then the bottom 2 boxes represent disagreement with the survey statement. So they chose to identify that either that thing that was indicated in the question either had little value or holds no value to them as the respondent. Key insights from the survey as a result of analysis. The survey participant demographic was mainly white females with an income of less than $100,000. That was the largest percentage in terms of population of respondents that answered. Questions around cultural awareness for city staff were considered valuable or very valuable for the majority of the respondents to the survey in every category. Questions regarding diverse hiring practices were considered valuable or very valuable for the majority of respondents to the survey in every category.
Shanine?
Yes.
Shanine, on that number 1, you said females with an income of less than 100,000.
Yes.
That, to me, the way it's written, it means more than 100,000.
Less than would be the open end of the symbol to be the first thing that you read. So 100,000 greater than would be.
Well, that's a different interpretation from me, but let's go on. That's okay.
Okay. So, but it was, so people that had incomes of less than 100,000 that were self-identifying as white women. Questions surrounding public art and diverse representation were considered of neutral importance for the majority of respondents. 73% of respondents were English-speaking only households, and 25% or 137 of the 544 respondents lived in the city of Kenmore for 25 years or more. So those were some of the key insights in terms of demographic representation of those folks that we looked at. In terms of key strengths, some of the positive sentiments that were shared in the responses, respondents shared the strongest, and this was looking at all of the data, every respondent We looked at respondents in subcategories. We looked at respondents in terms of factors of demographic data. But in terms of positive sentiments, unless we indicate that there's any particular group being called out, you can assume that these were responses as I present that are for the totality of the population and not for any separate demographic factor that is a group within the whole. So respondents shared the strongest positive sentiment with factors ratings ranging from 81% to 84% when asked about issues relative to increased involvement in public land use, involvement with the Kenmore Police Department, and decisions related to the city's physical infrastructure. So the majority of respondents, or at least the strongest positive sentiment responses, were for issues associated with public land use, Kenmore Police Department in partnership or relationship with the department, and decisions related to the city's physical infrastructure. Working with the city of Kenmore to better understand how government works had a positive rating factor of 81%. There is moderate positive sentiment ratings for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So there were positive sentiments associated with DEIB, but certainly not as strong as those previously mentioned areas. So working with others in the community, diverse boards and commissions, increasing diverse voice and representation as part of public involvement, specifically historical narrative, arts, displays, events, etc., with positive factor ratings between 54 and 71%. So significantly less than the stronger opinions associated with public land use, infrastructure, and police, but certainly not as strong. So when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, the demographic population, particularly the respondents that we've spoken to, the vast majority of whom were Caucasian, non-Hispanic, did not have a strong positive sentiment regarding diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. More than the half, but certainly not as strong as other areas. Feeling included in decision-making was the top driver among City of Kenmore community respondents, most of whom are owners of single-family homes. Of the people that completed the survey, our respondents, we found that 73% were owners of single-family homes, and feeling connected and having a voice in decision-making in the city was the strongest factor of the group. More than half of respondents do believe it is important for the city's staff and leaders to focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, both within city government and as a resource to business and members of the community. And finally, creating opportunities to connect with others in the community and find resources to improve experience for all is front of mind. And so that was a very strong and common theme among respondents. I wanted to stop and let you reflect, ask any questions, or make statements if you'd like. Otherwise, I'll move on.
Shanine, so bottom line, what? Bottom line for these 6 points. What, in one sentence, what does it boil down to?
Diversity and inclusion matters for respondents to the survey, not as much as having a voice, having a say, and having a control in the infrastructure connecting with the police as others. There were positive statements made with regard to DEIB, but wasn't the most important thing for the majority of people that responded.
I agree. It'd be nice to add that somehow, because it is a good summary of all these points.
In terms of key opportunities, opportunities for improvement, opportunities for growth, opportunities for closer look. Negative sentiments. Respondents shared the lowest level of positive sentiments when responding to consideration of issues related to the evaluation of the historical narrative. the Historic Preservation Program, actions to determine if and how groups or people have been left out, ensuring diverse events and programs, celebration of everyone in the community, and working with diverse stakeholders on boards and commissions. The positive factor ratings were between 55 and 57%. So while there was a net positive, while there was more than half of the community felt that these things were important, certainly not as strong as other factors or areas. It seemed very clear in the data that given the demographic of the folks that responded, they responded to things that affected them more closely, them more personally. There were a lower percentage of people of color and underrepresented minorities that participated in the survey. Those folks felt that these issues were strong, having the opportunity to be seen and included. But for many of the people from the city of Kenmore, from Kenmore's community, they just didn't feel that these things were as important to them. There is a strong correlation between diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and loss of control, decision-making, and access among both short-term and long-term residents of the city of Kenmore. In the statements and comments, it seemed very clear in the data that DEIB represented more of a threat than it did a value add for many people. Respondents that self-identify as white or Caucasian men most often expressed the strongest negative sentiment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in matters relative to diverse representation, diverse hiring, and diverse programs. Within this same demographic population, there was a very strong positive sentiment toward having a voice, collaborating with government, and maintaining the status quo. While negative sentiments relative to DEIB was higher among stakeholders who did not self-identify as underrepresented racial minorities, those respondents who self-identified as white or Caucasian at the 25 to 75,000 income levels had significantly more positive sentiment toward diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So when we looked at the demographic break and the factors by race, factors by income, factors by gender, Caucasian non-Hispanics whose incomes fell below 25,000 had lower positive sentiments toward diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Caucasian non-Hispanic respondents whose incomes were above 75,000 had lower positive sentiment scores again when it came to issues relative to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. But Caucasian non-Hispanics whose income fell between 25 and 75,000 that were working class, that were more middle class, they had the highest positive sentiment scores with regard to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for the community. Reflections, responses, or questions? Nancy?
Thank you so much for sharing your data. I just really appreciate you for sharing that with us to begin with, but I'm still simmering and trying to synthesize all this like rich data that you've shared. And something that I feel like I'm seeing and noticing is, or questioning first, and I was trying to go through our previous emails, is the respondents' demographics compared to the demographics of the city and how those line up. And I know you shared that before, so I think I will try and find it, but I'm curious to see how that lines up, because I feel like the negative sentiments and that you've shared and that you've synthesized is like coming from a group that feels like that's not the group necessarily that we wanted to hear most from the folks that were the most marginalized. I think you shared like they tend to be male and white and having, I think what feels like, and I'm sorry, this is not well polished or articulated, these are just like what's bubbling up for me right now, because I'm trying to balance this feeling of like hearing these negative sentiments, and you captured it in like not wanting to change the status quo, like feeling defensive that maybe people's powers are being challenged. But I also saw comments like, we want everyone to be treated the same, like it's not important to talk about DEI, and why are you trying to divide us by like disaggregating data and looking at it? And it just feels like it completely misses the point of understanding what DEI is and what equity is. And so while these results are really important, and it's great to get to hear from people and like get their honest thoughts and where they are, not necessarily knowing where they are in their journey in DEI or understanding the importance of equity, like I just wonder like the weight that we would put on something like that as it influences thinking about education opportunities as you are forming, you and your firm is forming the DEI policy, because that lived experience from a person who may not have these same barriers as folks who are marginalized or BIPOC folks or having these other identities, like those aren't necessarily, that's not necessarily the folks that I feel like we were prioritizing and wanting to influence the DEI work. Yeah, sorry, that was just a lot of rambling, but I just have all these like different competing emotions of hearing and seeing these sentiments and wanting to center the humanity of each person and hearing how they feel, and at the same time, just like a little upset about, you know, that's how we uphold white supremacy, is like we like don't even really get to the root of how there's systemic racism embedded in these policies, whereas people want to kind of like level it off, like, you know, don't treat people differently by the color of their skin, but totally not even addressing or acknowledging like the systemic barriers that come from these embedded structures. And I think I'm just trying to verbally process all of this, because I think the state is really important, and I'm so glad we have it. And what is the weight, and you know, how much will that influence the work that we get to do, and acknowledging like maybe not everyone who we wanted to connect with and hear from, you know, was able to take an online survey, you know, like maybe we get to hear from those priority groups through focus groups, or they like to have more of that relational conversation, and keeping that in mind too. Like we got a great sample through the survey and the way that it was shared this time, but maybe that's not, you know, the absolute complete picture of getting to hear from everyone.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let me say this. We had 544 respondents to the survey. That is a very small population size for the totality that is all of the tens of thousands of people in the community of Kenmore, first of all. Second, while all of the findings may not be, you know, what anyone, especially a body like this, would hope to hear, I think that it's important to hear it, because as you mentioned, different people are at different places on the journey. And what this represents to me really is, and you'll find it in my recommendations shortly, it really represents what is the call to action. That people don't understand what we're trying to accomplish, so we better communicate. People want to see a value add and know that they have a place in this work, in our strategy and in the journey, and that's important. Because if people follow the national narrative or what they see online and in social media in some circles of the community, they think that diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is about trying to right historical wrongs by taking people that held privilege and removing the privilege from the previously privileged groups and giving it to folks who are marginalized, and then somehow intentionally causing or creating harm for people that held privilege, when in fact that is not the purpose and goal of non-discrimination policy. The goal and purpose of that is to open access, to ensure opportunity and improve outcomes for everyone, while we know that historically everyone haven't enjoyed that. So it's about better communicating. It's to educate, engage, and empower stakeholders across the community. So this doesn't slow down what you do. It should be your call to action. Juliana?
Yes, thank you so much, Shannon. I wanted to echo some of my thoughts when I've been simmering on everyone's responses. And when I was reading all the comments that you sent out, and I read every single one, two things really struck me. One, similar to what you said, I feel like many of these responses were really narrowing in on a very specific narrative about what they believe DEI was. And it felt like it really was about, Black and white and race. And of course, race and cultural heritage is a key part of why we're all gathered here. And the last years have been really heated and highlighted the importance of that. But our Kenmore initiative and our conversations these last few months have included so many other types of diversity of mental health and aging and accessibility and so many rich considerations. And it really was crushing for me to see how many people I feel like didn't even get that. To them, it was this very racially polarized thing that we were all taking a charge on, instead of thinking oh my goodness, when we're talking about belonging and accessibility in the community, that is everybody. And that can be you at many times of your life. We have a city council member who's been very gracious in talking about her experiences of having all types of housing situations of, being in a single family home and then fleeing domestic violence and being a renter, and how that journey through different experiences and different vulnerabilities is a journey, right? And if we're all hoping to age, that means that sometimes we're all going to be the people who are carrying out the curb cuts and the pedestrian walkways. And, as my family has grown, so has the races and disabilities that have, become part of my family. And it was really sad for me to see how many people were really narrowing what they believed DEI was in a very othering, us versus them, zero-sum power dynamic. So I just wanted to share that. And I felt like it was in line with what you were saying, Shannon, and what we're doing here in Kenmore is, I believe, broader and richer than some of the really fear-based national narratives around DEI.
Yeah. And for people that would read all of those comments, it would be easy to walk away with the perception that there was an undercurrent of anti-Black racism.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mr. Gill? Carlos?
Yeah, two things. The second point there is the one that really speaks out to me, and the idea that there's a fear of loss of control, loss of decision making, and so on. So that stands out to me as perhaps the most important point here, and in many ways it's not a surprise. And so I guess the other point that I have is, do you have any idea of how I admit this is a very small sampling, but I think with regard to the sampling, it's important to keep in mind that you noted that most of the respondents were women, white women, and you said making more than $100,000. And so my question is, do you have any sense of how we might compare to some other city?
I'll say this first, a little bit of clarification. The majority of respondents weren't white women. They were just the largest demographic population. So when you did a breakdown of the different groups of folks, in terms of a population size, they were one of the larger population size when we break folks down by demographic. And it was Caucasian non-Hispanic women with incomes less than $100,000. And then what was the second part of the question, Carlos?
The second part was whether you had any idea of comparisons with some other city in Washington state.
In terms of the sentiment scores and the insights?
Yes.
Yeah, I can benchmark you against several other East Side cities. So for example, with the city of Bothell and the city of Kenmore, or I'm sorry, the city of Bothell and the city of Kirkland, having administered the survey or done assessments of those community surveys, Kenmore, and I shared this with some of the city staff earlier, Kenmore really does stand out as a little bit of an outlier. I was quite frankly a little surprised by some of the findings given what other community members in neighboring cities have shared. The city of Kirkland had several hundred responses more. City of Bothell had about the same number of responses, but the undercurrent of negativity, what felt like a hostility, just wasn't present and wasn't as prevalent, I should say, wasn't as prevalent as it was for the city of Kenmore. Kenmore seemed to stand out for the for its lower factor rating in terms of valuing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, seemed to stand out in terms of seeing the importance of everyone seeing themselves included in the historical narrative and celebrating diverse events. For the city of Redmond, for example, in community listening sessions and surveys, people felt that it was incredibly important to them, that it was strongly important to make sure that diverse events happen, that the city participated, as well as for the city of Kirkland, that the city participated in facilitating those kinds of events to make sure that they happen, to ensure that voice and representation was there, that there was physical and psychological safety for people to participate. Those were some of the strongest and highest positive sentiment factors. So for us to do a word count and word analysis, for example, in the open-ended questions, words like diversity and equity, inclusion and voice and belonging and representation were the least counted words in the open-ended narrative responses. So yeah, it was pretty disheartening to see that in this community.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. The main findings from the dashboard data. So what you see are the different questions that were asked as part of the survey. And in the responses, we did not factor issues like age, gender, years lived in Kenmore, languages spoken, race or ethnicity or household income. So what you see are the responses in totality from all of the community of Kenmore collectively, or the 544 respondents that responded to these questions. Questions 1 through 3. It's important for city staff to examine and discuss how their work is impacted by race, gender, culture, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, ability, age, among other factors of identity. Holds no value or little value. So when you look at those two blue swaths, that's a pretty high percentage of respondents. The third question, it's important for Kenmore City Council and city staff to have difficult or sensitive conversations about institutional racism, personal bias, discrimination, cultural differences, disability, or power inequities throughout the city. And again, holds no value or little value, very strong, very high, negative sentiment scores. Now, while you have a lot of neutral, but the vast majority of those responses are positive, it's important to note how the population size shifts and changes. I personally feel Kenmore is a safe, welcoming, inclusive city. When you ask a majority population, of course they feel like it's inclusive, it's representative, it's safe, it's built and designed you know, in terms of the historical narrative for a very specific demographic and population. When you see yourself in government, when you see yourself represented, when you see yourself in the art and in the richness and all that a community holds, you'll feel that it's safe, welcoming, and inclusive because you see yourself. But when asked that the city's leaders and staff should consider those folks that don't see themselves, look at how high the negative sentiment scores rise. So now you're asking, don't look at just the majority population. Let's consider those folks who are and underrepresented, marginalized isn't just Black and brown folks. We talked specifically about ability, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, culture, gender, you know, many other factors. And those were not things that for many people, you know, were something that staff and others should focus on. When we looked at questions numbers 4 through 6, race relations, cultural competency, and discrimination training for all of Kenmore City staff. Very high, you know, negative sentiment scores in terms of holds absolutely no value or little value. Equitable and diverse hiring, retention, and promotion practices for City of Kenmore employees. Again, very high in terms of benchmarking against neighboring communities, very high in terms of negative sentiment scores. But again, the majority of the population felt that these things were valuable or very valuable, but to see this high of a negative sentiment where people thought that they should have no focus, and especially examination of the historical code or laws and policies that impact equity and opportunities today, those are very high in negative sentiment scores. And you'll see them shift as topical information comes up where those issues are not being asked. In questions 7 through 9, developing an equity tool to help city staff and city council understand how their decisions and actions may impact marginalized groups and those people with unequal access and impacts. You would think that that would be 100% in terms of positive sentiment. Leading community conversations and education to help community members better understand someone who's different from them. Connecting community organizations and demographic leaders to support their community building efforts. So now you see a shift where the positive sentiment scores increase, negative sentiment begins to decrease. But again, questions where there seems to be a direct connection or correlation between topics where you name or imply diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, there are negative sentiment scores associated with that. Finding better ways to capture, evaluate, and incorporate more inclusive and diverse community input into decision-making. Providing liaison and problem-solving services to underrepresented and historically marginalized groups and community members so they can better access city services. Now, what we've heard from community members is when it comes to business opportunity, business investment and development, supplier diversity, providing assistance to small businesses and businesses of women and minorities. Partnering with the Chamber of Commerce, those were things with the Bothell Kenmore Chamber of Commerce. Those were things that that I know that the Chamber of Commerce is hoping to have. Those are things that I know that underrepresented, especially the Latinx community, wants to have. So when you factor by race, factor by income, then those numbers shift. But even something like addressing human service needs and communicating more with nonprofit organizations, then the positive sentiment shifts up. The negative seems to bubble where people aren't quite sure, where they may not be ready to commit to a positive sentiment, but at least they're thinking about it, they're not sure. So they're not sure, but not enough to say that it's negative, but not willing to commit to positive. But again, there's a downshift in terms of negative sentiment scores. So there is that trend. Mr. Gill? And I'm hoping what you all take away is still to look at the pink and the purple. The majority of the community still feel that these are positive things. And then in the middle, the deeper purple in the middle, there were no responses to those. So, a couple of folks that just didn't respond. But in terms of positive sentiment, you still have strong positive sentiment scores. People still believe in those things and think that they either are valuable or very valuable to the community. Go ahead, Carlos.
Carlos, you're on mute.
You're on mute. We got to get you off on mute. I can't take you off. You'll have to.
On mute.
There you go.
Really?
Yep.
Okay. So on the left side, the blue and the dark blue,
Yep.
you were saying earlier that these percentages were very high. Okay. And so is the very high in comparison to the other communities, or is it the very high in just in moral terms?
It's high when you compare it to when you benchmark it against local communities, but it's also very high when you look at the many different questions. So these questions are asked thematically. And so when we looked at questions where DEIB wasn't expressly articulated, the negative sentiment score is shifted down. As soon as you ask a question where it seems to be the implication that it's associated with diversity, equity, inclusion, consideration in terms of training, learning, opportunity, voice, representation, those seem to have an upshift, an uptick in terms of increased negative sentiment scores. So even at the slide here, addressing human services needs and communicating more with nonprofits, the negative sentiment scores are half as much as they are as soon as you talk about historically marginalized groups or diverse communities.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So there's certainly a shift. There certainly seems to be a pattern in practice in terms of perception and how folks have responded to these questions. And again, providing support for minority and women-owned businesses, assisting businesses to help them improve their equitable and diverse hiring practices, translating city materials in multiple languages and expanding language interpretation services. I'm surprised to see 22% of the population feel that that holds no value or little value for a community that is increasing in terms of diverse community membership. Assisting businesses to help them improve their own equitable and diverse hiring practices. You're approaching 30% where people feel that that holds no value or little value, to make sure that people are doing everything that they can to open access and ensure opportunity for all people in an increasingly diverse community. I'll also say that when I looked at the community scan in terms of demographics, I wanted to look at these responses and look at the census data. So I looked at 2015 to 2019 American Community Survey data. I looked at 2000 and as well as 2010 census data. And I'm certainly happy to go back and look again, but what I do know, having looked 3 times, is that the city of Kenmore experienced a significant population shift downward in terms of people of color and diverse representation in the city. There seemed to be a little bit of an exodus with particular attention paid to folks of Asian descent. There seemed to be a little bit of a bump where I can't remember what it was, but it may have been something in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% in terms of a downshift in folks that self-identified as Asian in the city of Kenmore's community. So take a look at the survey scan that I sent folks. Look at all of the data is on the same in the same slides. I'm going to go back and I'm looking forward to looking at data from the most recent census from 2020, but I want to look and take a closer look at the population shift in terms of people of color, underrepresented minorities, and especially the Asian population. There seemed to be an uptick in Kirkland, an uptick in Redmond, and an uptick in Bothell. So, you know, folks could have moved to anywhere in the country or world, but it seemed that there was a growth in population in those neighboring communities and a loss in those populations for the city of Kenmore. I don't know that I've seen any other community lose share in those populations. Everybody else has seen it grow. So that also stood out as something to note, and makes Kenmore a little bit of an outlier. Now, I don't know if there's a direct correlation between these sentiments for this small population size, how people see themselves or don't see themselves, or whether or not they feel welcomed and included by their neighbors. But those two things have certainly happened in the same vacuum together. Questions 16 through 18. So again, take a look at questions 17 and 18. More public involvement in decisions about land use, zoning, and affordable housing strategy. More public involvement, increased communication and engagement with Kenmore Police Department. Then all of a sudden you see the very rapid and over the cliff downward shift in terms of negative sentiment scores, and then a burgeoning of positive sentiment scores. And then Kenmore City staff and City Council working more closely with existing and diverse volunteer boards and commissions. All of a sudden you start to approach 20% where you have negative sentiment scores. So hard to not to see that.
Shannon, sorry to interrupt you. It's Lily.
Yep.
Hi. I know we have the link to download Power BI, but I wondered if you happen to have pulled data on to make a correlation between the negative sentiment we are seeing related to words like diversity and income.
Mm-hmm. You can do that. We did do that. That is in our notes, which is why we pulled and looked at women, Caucasian, non-Hispanic, income, men, to look at groups specifically. We also did those factors by race of underrepresented minorities. So we didn't focus on just Caucasian, non-Hispanics. We looked at how Latinx folks, how Asian folks, how Black folks, 2 or more races, and people that didn't identify. And we saw the strongest in terms of negative sentiment for people who identified as Caucasian, non-Hispanic. Those folks who refused to self-identify, we saw some of those same negative factors, but not as strong in people that self-identified as underrepresented minorities.
I see. So from that conclusion, is it safe to say then that the negative sentiment would correlate to the higher income white male?
No, you could find those negative sentiments across populations. So, but those negative sentiments were more prevalent in folks whose income were under 25,000, so lower income, and those people who were higher income and over 75,000. But in terms of negative sentiment scores, to isolate and see where the largest percentage of the population of respondents had those negative sentiment scores, you are more likely then to find those not in populations that are underrepresented, but in terms of race, but people who negative sentiments were more prevalent in people who were Caucasian, non-Hispanic. And again, you can use the Power BI, the dashboard, and toy around and, you know, click different things, and you'll be able to find a lot of that as well.
Yeah, what led me to ask the question, just thinking out loud, from the written comments, I got a sense that some people were trying to relay, hey, I'm really struggling here. I can't put food on my table. Why are you asking me about diversity and inclusion? It's almost like the nature of, as a human being, you want to have shelter, you need to have food before you can think about anything else. And I wonder if there's a component of that in the responses with the negative sentiment.
2 things. Number one, The survey title and explanation was that it was a diversity, equity, and inclusion survey. We were soliciting input in terms of community sentiment around the culture of the community. And then when you look at those responses and open-ended questions, people seem very clear. It wasn't as much a concern of immediate needs of themselves and their family. It was, it seemed to be what diversity, equity, and inclusion represented, and what they thought it represented and what they thought it didn't. And in those open-ended responses, there didn't seem to be any immediacy. You know, people make statements that we're making something out of nothing, that these are non-issues, that these aren't issues that are important for the city of Kenmore. These are not things that should be discussed. So people were very clear in the open-ended question. So if you haven't taken a look at those, I would encourage you to take a look and read the statements that people made that answered the survey.
All right, thank you.
Nancy?
It seemed from my interpretation that these second two questions, so more public involvement in decisions and land use, and then the last one, some more public involvement, again, like that feels really relevant to, I think, what Carlos was pointing out and what one of your earlier slides was saying too, about like this feel of maybe like a loss of power. And what's coming up in my mind is that it almost feels like when we're talking about DEI in this survey, it almost like it had this really negative connotation for maybe some folks who are taking the survey, whether that's related to a larger conversation or social influence and how DEI is talked about. I saw comments in the open comment section about, like, you know, stop this woke agenda, which had a very it felt like a very negative connotation, but underlying to my interpretation was that it felt like a fear of a loss of power, of maybe like being not intentionally left out of a process of that decision making. And so, I mean, I'm curious, you know, if we were to have a similar survey, but get to like the heart of the questions we're asking, which feels like these two questions were a little avoiding words that just had this negative connotation for some groups of people based on national rhetoric or whatever else folks may be hearing outside of the survey that they were reading, or maybe a misunderstanding or perception of what DEI really means. So Shannon, you were telling us like DEI isn't to flip-flop the power dynamic or privilege, or to flip-flop the hierarchy or structure that we currently live in. It's to truly approach all folks with this centering of dignity. And I feel like in other conversations I've heard, you know, it feels like a very threatening approach to talk about DEI because of that loss of power, because of a fear of like being labeled maybe a bad person based off of the way you look. Have heard those that come up before. And so I feel like these questions that you're showing us and this data of the responses of where we're using language that maybe gets at the crux of the goal of DEI without using words that maybe have garnered a negative connotation to some folks. Like we really get to, I wonder if we would uncover that folks would have more, you know, positive sentiment about, caring about members of our community. And maybe if they had the understanding of what DEI really meant, or the goal of it, the outcomes that we're looking for, not that it's a flip-flop of power dynamics or hierarchy structure, that it's more of a equity approach. I just wonder, yeah, how these, you know, what our outcomes would have looked like then.
I think that for some members of the community, if you are to, you know, in doing this work, one of the things that I'm charged with doing is making sure that I'm acutely aware of different themes and messaging and communication, keeping a pulse of the data, of some of the data sets that you can get from social media sites like Facebook, Twitter, and other channels. And right now, there is a very strong sentiment in the media, mainstream media and social media and other places, of something called replacement theory. And there is this idea that people from underrepresented groups, racial minorities, and immigrants are trying to replace people who are Caucasian, non-Hispanic in leadership, control, and influence. And I think that when you read some of the responses, while people may not expressly say that, I think that it would not be a leap or a stretch to say that you found that in some of the comments and in some of the sentiment. So I don't know that we need to create flowery, more beautiful and accessible language in specifically articulating that it's important to have diverse boards, that it's important for people to have voice and to have everyone be represented in government or have a place in space. I think that you have to call those things out so that you're explicitly clear in that. But again, when you read many of the open-ended comments, it seems clear that people know exactly what we're saying. They just have very strong feelings about this topic in this space.
Shannon, can I ask you to share if you remember the timing of the survey for Bothell and Kirkland? Was it a few years back?
With Kirkland, it was a year ago, and with Bothell, it was a year before last.
Okay. So are you saying that perhaps the climate right now influenced the responses because it's so much in everyone's top of mind and
yeah. Go ahead, Carlos.
I think in response to Lily's question, whether these results are reflecting the current political scene, in my view, these measurements are simply beginning to uncover what I think have been fears all along for a long time. And I think in many ways, the growth of what I might refer to as the diversity industry, people like you working on behalf of organizations, that work has simply helped to sharpen the issues that are in many ways lie in all of this. I mean, we're talking about racism in Mainland. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. And when you move closer to increased representation in communities, when you move closer toward an increased participation in government leadership, I've done this work for more than 20 years, and I've watched the shifts, and I can articulate the different inflection points when the narrative and conversations in these spaces shift and change. And this is another one of those inflection points. I want to make sure that I go through recommendations. And again, you task force members, you all, as well as the public, have access to all of these documents. This document in particular is 101 pages. I'm not going to go through all of the appendix. I'm going to stop at the recommendations, but I'm sharing with you my recommendation and insight based on international best practice and what I know to be good practice in order to move forward based on this information. In terms of communication, communicate both the significance and value add of DEI openly, broadening the circle to include staff, community, and leadership. The Kenmore City Council and City Manager's Office should share key highlights from the survey and assessment, resulting in clear messaging, expression of priorities, and alignment with City of Kenmore organizational and community values. The City of Kenmore stakeholders or community must know what diversity, equity, and inclusion represents and what it doesn't. There is a negative connotation associated with a program intended to bring good to all of the community. According to the U.S. Census reports from 2015 to 19, of the 5-year estimate in 2010, there's been a year-over-year decrease in the population sizes of racial and ethnic minorities. The City of Kenmore must do more to increase its connection with stakeholders that fall within those categories. Work to improve communication channels in multiple modalities across the city to include languages other than English, also include American Sign Language and other accessible modes of communication. Create a platform that allows for the community to engage with one another around DEI-related topics, issues, and opportunities. Accountability. Everyone that is part of the City of Kenmore community should have the opportunity for education, engagement, and empowerment relative to DEI. Create training and learning opportunities that are available for all of the community to better understand the goals of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and its impacts on the City of Kenmore's community. Create formal relationships with organizations whose goal and mission is to improve the lives and outcomes of marginalized members of the community, with a particular emphasis on individuals with disabilities, senior citizens, low-income people, homeless, racial and ethnic minorities. And these relationships should be leveraged to improve communication and partnership with those impacted community members. Embed DEI strategy across each city department and establish measurable objectives to hold leaders accountable for results. The City of Kenmore should permanently seat a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging board that regularly meets with and it advises the Kenmore City Council. The City of Kenmore website should clearly and plainly highlight opportunities for community stakeholders to find ways to participate in DEIB efforts, both in partnership with the city government and across the Kenmore community. Understanding. Dig deeper into the experiences and outcomes of members of the community. Conduct annual focus groups among demographic groups with special attention to populations with lowest engagement with City of Kenmore leaders, departments, and Kenmore community. Probe into the biggest areas of concern: safety, feeling included and belonging, having a voice in city government, opportunities in business, civic, and social life, and representation in the workforce across the community. Address the value add of DEI strategies and their impact on all of the community. There is a strong undercurrent of misunderstanding and or hostility toward creating a community that reflects everyone. Regularly survey Kenmore community members. Conduct focus groups listening sessions to ascertain experience and outcomes to better inform strategic decision-making. Collect and analyze data to better inform decision-making. Investment. Adequately resource diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies for long-term sustainable success. That means ensuring appropriate staffing levels to communicate, scale, and support DE&I goals and strategies both within City of Kenmore government and the Kenmore community. Regular outreach and engagement with the community should be a central strategy to increasing understanding, getting community buy-in of DEI efforts as well. Identify both internal and external opportunities to champion DE&I through sponsorship, partnership, collaboration, and or resource commitment, including in-kind support. Review annual DE&I policy plan and goals to ensure appropriate funding levels for successful execution of strategic planning. Regularly review and assess DE&I initiatives for impact using data and metrics and staff and community comment. And finally, support. Increase efforts to build partnerships, support, and retain local businesses and organizations while reaching individuals and institutions. That means create and maintain a strong supplier diversity program to increase diverse business opportunity with the City of Kenmore's government. So supplier diversity. Establish and or participate in a business development program. This partner should be with the Kenmore Bothell Chamber of Commerce to support and assist as existing and future minority and women-owned businesses in the City of Kenmore. Establish a municipal leadership development program to better support both understanding of how government works and how community members can participate. Special emphasis should be placed on the participation of underrepresented members of the community, specifically disabled, homeless, low income, racial minorities, etc. And then finally, work with members of the Kenmore community to create encourage, support, advertise, and fund programs and events that will allow for the many emerging cultures of the city of Kenmore to be highlighted and celebrated. Community members must better understand their neighbors and leverage that understanding to improve relationships and experience. I want to stop and give you a chance to respond and reflect and ask questions if you like.
So Shannon,
Go ahead.
now that we know, I'm still digesting the fact that now there's a segment of the population that I wasn't really counting on, which are the ones that are against or seem to be taking off by DEI. So now that we know the segment of the population exists, do we work to educate them? Do we want them to change their minds? Like, what do we do with this information?
My strong feeling is that everyone is entitled to their own sincerely held beliefs. It's not our job, it's not our right, it's not our role or responsibility to force change of anyone's sincerely held beliefs. People are entitled to believe as they choose. But at the same time, people are not afforded the right to their own set of facts. And the fact of the matter is that the city of Kenmore is growing. It is not to the same pace as your neighboring communities, increasing its level of diversity. And those folks that may be new or different than the typical population that Kenmore has enjoyed in the past, while they may not see the value add, the fact of the matter is that there is value to creating a welcoming and inclusive community where everybody feels like they belong, they're heard, and they can be seen. There is a very strong messaging in our findings that people want to know how government works. They want to have a voice, they want to have control, but you cannot have that control for some and not others. That is fact. No community that is divided will never thrive. A community that is divided among itself and fights among itself can never prosper. It's not sustainable in the long term. History has shown us that is true. And so, again, I think that it's important to note a couple things. Number one, this isn't the negative sentiment isn't the majority of Kenmore's population. The majority of the population believes that these things are important, that they hold some value or a lot of value. It's disheartening to know that the negative sentiment scores are as high as they are. And in some areas, you'd hope that there'd be some uniformity. But even within the populations of folks that have the negative sentiment or the correlation between DEI and not being a value add to the community, they saw the importance of knowing how government works, having a voice and participating. It just wasn't made clear that seemed to be what the desire was for everybody. But again, I think that for you to know that this is a very small segment of the population and you got to meet people where they are. That means that we have to do a better job of educating, engaging, and empowering, making sure that we do all that we can, that everybody can see themselves reflected in their own local city government. And not just the people that live and work in Kenmore, but the people that will come because, visitors in Kenmore is your lifeblood. You have businesses that depend on outsiders, people outside of the community to come in and shop. You depend on that commerce. You depend on people that maybe can't afford to live in Kenmore working in Kenmore. You can't put up a wall as a community and isolate yourself and think that you'll thrive in this region. And so in terms of long-term sustainable growth and the success of all of the community, even the folks that may not see the value add, they benefit from those many that come into the community that maybe don't live in the community, or maybe look different than the old guard that are the folks that were typical for the community 50 years ago, 25 years ago, or whatever, right? So this is important. I think
Right.
the call to action is to do a better job of communicating, expressing the value add, and growing.
Right. So if we focus on the value add, the hope is that everyone will benefit. And we might not change minds completely, but we might spread the benefit.
Juliana?
I also want to add, Lily, that I am an optimist that maybe some people are more afraid of the unknown than they are actually of their diverse neighbors. And so when we're talking in these hypotheticals and these initiatives, you know, the unknown is very scary, and there's extreme examples on media and social media. But if maybe some more Kenmore initiatives are things like the farmers market, or these movie nights, or some of these, you know, these local events, you know, on their Burt Gilman or with their schools, those I think can really chip away and help people change hearts in a much more sincere way than things that, you know, are just hypothetical ideas, right? I don't know if the farmers markets downtown exactly fall in the DEI bucket exactly, but I know my family went last night, that there, you know, these fantastic local markets downtown Kenmore. And, you know, my family, we saw a diversity of races, language, wheelchair users, elderly grandma. I had my young children, and it was fantastic. And I met new neighbors that I had not met that literally live houses away from me. So I'm really hopeful that as some of our, whatever the DEI events unfold as, the reality of those will be more heartwarming and less scary than the unknown. When right now we're a lot of buzzwords and there's just a lot of fear. And I'm really hopeful that maybe as some of these things actually unfold and people actually talk to their neighbors, some of things just simmer into a better place. That's my optimism and prayer, at least.
Thank you. Carlos?
Yeah, right. I think one takeaway, by the way, Shanine, you've done excellent work.
Thank you.
From my point of view, it's excellent work. But I think one takeaway that I can identify, I've been in Kenmore for a very, very long time. And I was always aware, of course, that the suburban area that became the city of Kenmore was always white. I knew that. I knew that I was one of very few minority residents in the city. And I knew that not all members of this area were on the same level of accepting me personally if they ever came to meet me. So I think one takeaway is that this the survey kind of identifies sort of a 25% of the population more or less not being so progressive minded, more conservative, less willing to be open, and yeah, so there ought to be some kind of communication, information, education, so that the rest of the population knows that you know, we're not gonna eat their pie. We're gonna just share it with everybody else.
And what's important, Carlos, to note is when people think that there's only one pie to be had and they're fighting for the crumbs of it,
right?
They don't realize that there's a bakery and supplies and the capacity to bake more pies.
I absolutely agree.
Imagine if in Amazon's early days they thought that, you know, when they were leasing the old VA building, that there was only so much pie to be had.
Yeah.
There would not be the behemoth that they are today. They've grown. Microsoft is much bigger than they were when they started. Boeing is much bigger than it was when it started. Kenmore is much bigger than it was when it started. There's more pies to be baked in half. Juanita?
Yes, I was going over the survey and it's made clear that our efforts, we need to keep this going. We need to keep the work going. And that's what I saw from that there's going to be people that think if you give something to somebody, that's going to take away from them. There's other people who think that a rising tide lifts all boats. And I think we need to give people experiences too, to help them feel empowered and help them feel like they experience that the understanding of what we're trying to do, not just talk about it, but we need to experience it and have them, everybody experience it, have, a walk, talk about how it feels to be, for me to walk down the street to see something that is representative of me, of where I come from. That is very, very powerful to me. And I haven't often seen it especially in film and the arts. It's every time I see a movie from the 90s, it wasn't until later that I was people like me were represented, and that I felt, oh my gosh, I can, I can identify with that person, looks like me.
Yeah.
And a shared experience to talk about that stuff, I think is very powerful. And I think that everybody has, one of the things I like to, I've done this many times in many classes, is where you just have a piece of paper in front of you and you just draw. You say, what is it meant? What does this particular thing look to me? Look like if I had, how could I make it the way I want to make it? And you just draw, and and it could be something like, how, as a person that has mobility issues, how does that look like for me to experience walking down the street to go to City Hall? And I think those experiences, they bring out important little pieces of information, but I also think that is something, an experience like that helps empower somebody that they can actually have that that knowledge that comes from them, and they can say, they can express it. Maybe it's hard for them to express it verbally, but they have it there, and then they feel like they have controls of how they can express themselves. And I think we need different ways of expressing how we feel and our ideas. And so I think that would be, if activities like that, that would be something that we could get together and do. I feel that there's a lot of people in our community, I think, that which are very willing to help out. And I think we need to use that cultural capital, that I think there's a lot of that in Kenmore. And I think that and I will be honest, some of the comments they were hard to read, but that is also what research is. You go through it, and you have to go through the data and look at that, even though you might feel a certain way, but you have to recognize it and recognize your own feelings as well. It was great that we had that survey to get that information from, so that we're just not making assumptions, or that there is some data to go through. And I think that is really a really important thing. And I'm glad for this surveys because we have this data to go on, that we're not just making assumptions, that we do have some data to go on to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And David or Aisha, did you have anything you wanted to share?
Yes, thank you so much, Shannon. My heart sunk when I saw the initial comments, right? I know this, but I didn't know it intellectually. I mean, data doesn't lie, right? So it was shocking to me to really be faced with the truth. But I am very happy about the recommendations, because the recommendations, if taken seriously and appreciated, will definitely impact the change that we're all here for. How we want our communities to look like, to improve, and 10, 20 years from now, that change will be evident in every aspect of government, in every sidewalk going to the park and going to the farmer's market. So I am optimistic regarding this amazing recommendations you put together. So I hope the city takes it all and even request more, if it's possible, to really implement this and get behind all of the recommendation. That was just my comment. Thank you.
Thanks. Go ahead, David.
Hi, everyone. I'd just like to say that I'm not surprised on some of the negative aspects of the survey. When I was out dropping off flyers at some of the local businesses, some were put off by it and others were welcoming. I think creating a more diverse, more diversity within the city would be great. Greater outreach by the city, getting city council involved in some of the initiatives that are going to make a big difference. And just making that a focus of the city itself and how it interacts with the population will make a big difference moving forward. I've been involved recently with the City of Kenmore's Pride event. We have a city, council member file is involved with that, and that's fantastic. And I think we're going to have a great event, and I invite you all out to that on the 18th and march in the parade on the 26th. Thank you.
Thanks. Juliana?
I just also wanted to echo David's comments and other speakers that I really love the recommendations you outlined, Shannon. They are fantastic. After reading the data, I was kind of thinking, oh, so now what? And your recommendations are above and beyond more articulate than anything I had brainstormed. So thank you so much for you and your team. This has just been fantastic, not just the data collection, but all the thoughtful organization. And so just want to thank you, and I support them. So yes.
Thank you. Carlos.
Yes, one last comment. I like to read history books. And I can bet you that if I were to review the history of municipal evolution, that what we are doing here, what the city of Kenmore is doing, and other municipalities, this is really far out. The idea of a municipal government seeking to integrate to the greatest possible extent the inclusion of its diverse residents. I don't think that there are many instances until recently when I think this idea of diversity began to spring up and become popular, beginning about 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I may be wrong, but this is pretty special stuff. That's the only thing I want to say. Thank you.
I wanted to give you something to end on a little bit of a positive note. I don't know that you were if this was made available, but I was sent an email from Stephanie Lukash, who's works with the city manager's office. She's in charge of the American Rescue Plan Act funding. And she sent me an email and she was excited. And her specific role is the assistant city manager, American Rescue Plan Act administrator for City of Kenmore. She's also the vice president of the Washington City and County Management Association. And she shared with me, and it's available as a press release for the City of Kenmore, that Kenmore receives Municipal Excellence Award for American Rescue Plan Act response, or their ARPA response. The Association of Washington Cities recently announced that the City of Kenmore was awarded a Municipal Excellence Award for its American Rescue Plan Act response. The City of Kenmore is one of 5 cities honored this year for putting creative ideas to use for their community. The AWC will present this award to the City of Kenmore AWC's annual conference later this month. This year's winning project highlights just a few of the ways that Washington cities are leading with innovation and resilience to solve a diverse range of challenges, including affordable housing, public health, and economic recovery. And the thing that they called out was the fact that the award is a positive reflection on the entire community. That was from Mayor Herbig. But really it was because Stephanie and team went above and beyond to try and figure out, what do you do with ARPA funds? They solicited insight from the community. They did a listening session and survey. They went out and found community partners. They made sure that they brought in community stakeholders from all across the community. They looked for diverse perspectives, experience, insights, and opinion before coming to a conclusion and decision. Build nothing for them without them. They built a solution for the community with the community. So that is to be championed. It's celebrated. It's clearly being celebrated. The City of Kenmore is being awarded for being forward thinking to engage the community, to solve for the community. And the fact that that is still today considered creative, innovative, and forward thinking, that shouldn't be the standard for everybody. I think that the City of Kenmore should be proud of that. Because when you think about the beloved community and the value add, those folks who may not understand quite what DEIB is, will enjoy that in the equity of their homes, the welcomeness of their community, and to be a shining example of what cities do right. And you folks as a task force are an example and manifestation of a city doing things right. So don't question and challenge that. Juliana, when you ask, I'll be quick before I ought to let you go. But if you wonder, is the farmer's market one of those things? The thing that I ask every city that I work with in terms of what are you doing and what qualifies as something that is anti-racist, that is equitable, that is welcoming, that represents social justice and the public goodwill. Anything that seeks to improve access for employees or community members to data and information, reduce disproportionality and disparate outcomes, increase access to information, services, tools, or resources, improved communication across government for both employees and community members, to develop, design, and deliver policies that meet the needs of an increasingly diverse population. Anything that seeks to improve the health outcomes and life expectancy of its community members, increased improvement of employment and income opportunities, and to provide educational support and improve learning opportunities either in schools, the workplace, or the community. And then, and also importantly, increased accessibility of affordable housing and or reduction of homelessness. Anything that does those things for a community. Those are the things that count. Those are DEIB social justice, anti-racist, inclusion, and belonging efforts. Anything that would allow for one person to honor the humanity and dignity of another, to build community, and to live together in peace, anything that does that should be the goal and the desired state. So I will stop talking, pivot, and turn it back over to Leonora, and I'll let Leonora close your meeting out.
So thank you, task force members, for your comments and your contributions. As you can see, we have a ways to go, and that's why we need you. Thank you so much, and we'll see you at the next meeting on Thursday, June 23rd. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Good night, everyone. We're waving at you. Hello, bye-bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
And goodbye in the council chambers.
Goodbye, our
All right,
friends.
thank you so much.
Special shout out before we start recording to Anastasia and team in the council chambers. They've been an invaluable asset, an incredible collaborative partner and resource. You folks that are sitting in there that are working and holding things down, I want to thank you so much from the top and bottom of my heart on behalf of my team. The partnership that I've had with Leonora and with Rob and Janet and Lauren and everybody, folks like you would make it possible to have the success that we do, because we couldn't do this meeting without you. So thank you, team in chambers. And I look forward to seeing you all at the next meeting.
Thank you, Tila and Maura and Anastasia.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, guys.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.